Hi again. I am back to make a short video talking mostly about starter and starter maintenance and feeding schedules. I have continued to bake during the pandemic, and I know a lot of you have seen my previous video about Tartine 101, how to make tartine sourdough bread, and your comments and likes have really meant a lot to me, and it's been fun to see how everyone's progressing. Just as a reminder, I'm just a home baker and I really enjoy making and sharing my sourdough bread. I know there are a lot of people out there making videos and some of them much more professional than this, but I'm happy to share what I have learned in my sourdough journey. So I know a couple of the comments that were put on my video were asking about how to create your own starter and how to maintain a starter. So just as a high-level summary, sourdough starter is really made of three components. Well, two plus a little bit of natural magic. So you make your starter by mixing flour and water. And ideally, if you mix it with your hands, then you'll insert some of the wild yeast that lives on your hands as well as in the air, as well as in the flour itself. What I want to talk about more today is about the maintenance of your starter. So in my previous video, which apologies if you haven't seen it, but it's going to be linked down below, I talk about really what is a workable schedule, and the fact is starter is very, very flexible, and it actually can respond to lots of different types of feeding. So I think I may have mentioned that I actually left for 3 months a couple years ago, and I was able to freeze some of my starter and keep some of it just kind of dried out as a paste in the fridge. And when I came back, it took a little bit of that same frequency of feeding as if I was making a new starter, but it did come back to life and start showing signs of activity. So the starter I have here is actually the same starter that I started in 2016. And has been continuously maintained since then. Again, you hear about people who have starters that are hundreds of years old or passed down by generations. I am kind of a lazy baker, and so I don't really want to feed my starter every day. Part of it is just I have a busy life. I work, I've got kids, I've got other things that I'm trying to do. And the other thing is there is a lot of sourdough discard. And so every time you refresh your starter, what you're doing is both providing new fuel for your yeasts in your starter, and you're also reducing the acid load and kind of balancing it out. So if you have a starter that you don't feed and you leave it room temperature or even in the fridge, as it sits, the acid level, the lactic acid, will really increase, and that acid load will both affect the taste and the activity of the starter itself when you go to bake with it. And that is one of the key points I wanted to bring up today. So just as an example, I was mentioning that I tend to keep my starter in the fridge, which I still do. So I've started keeping it in a jar like this. You can see this is actually just a very small amount of starter. I put the date that I fed it, and it's really visible to me where it is and how it's looking. Just for the purposes of this video, I actually have another starter here that is a bit older. It's actually partially discard from a previous baking. And one of the things I want to show you, if I smell it, when I open it, it really smells like vinegar, as if it was like an apple cider vinegar kind of thing, really strong and pungent. And the other thing, and if I can tip my camera in, it's kind of gray and a little bit gross. So this starter, which has been sitting in the fridge untouched for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3, has separated a little bit. There's a liquid portion on top. The color of the liquid is gray, and the starter itself has a few bubbles, but it really kind of looks like kind of a muddy clay color. So this starter is not really very happy. I can tell that. The liquid on the top, which I looked it up, is called hooch, and it actually contains a fair amount of naturally occurring alcohol. So if this happened to your starter because you went away and you came back, you went on vacation, you forgot about it, you weren't baking sourdough or whatever, if this happens, it's okay, but don't bake with this sourdough. What you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna wanna pour off that top layer of liquid. Don't mix it in. Sometimes when this happens, I'll actually pour off the liquid and then I'll actually scrape off that top part that was kind of part of that gray. This is telling me that this sourdough is starving. This starter needs to be fed. So what you would do is take your normal tablespoon, feed it, but I would actually feed this sourdough probably twice a day until it seemed to have returned to a normal level of activity. And so I would feed it with a tablespoon of starter and about 150 grams of flour and 150 grams of water. You can reduce the proportions. Again, I always want to keep the flour and water the same proportions. So in that case, if I was doing 300 grams of flour and water and a little bit less than 10% of starter, I think that's okay. You can actually do something that's called a 20% proportion. So if I did my tablespoon, which again for me tends to be about 20 grams, you could do something like 75 grams of flour and 75 grams of water for a total of 150. And then your starter proportion is maybe between 15 and 20%. And having that percentage is not really that important, except to think about sort of the dilution effect of how much starter you're having and how much fuel you're providing it. So if your starter is 80% of what you're creating, it means you'll probably have a smaller volume, so you'll have less to discard later if you're doing this for a maintenance feeding. But also it means that your starter will go through that a little bit faster. So again, that's what to do if you have a starter that's been a little bit neglected and needs to be revived. You would just want to feed it maybe morning and night for a couple of days. And possibly and of course, when you feed it, you want to leave it at room temperature rather than putting it in the refrigerator. Again, temperature is very important to maintenance and care of sourdough starters. So if you put your starter that you fed in the fridge, it's going to be at a much colder temperature. It will liven up and mature, but very slowly. Whereas if you leave it at room temperature or even in a warmer place, as I mentioned before, I use my oven with the light on, which keeps it at about 75 degrees, which is warmer than my natural room temperature, which is maybe about 65 to 70. So just as my current routine, I am keeping my sourdough starter in the fridge. And so I took this and I fed it this morning. And one of the things I've really been paying attention to for my sourdough is how active my starter is. So in this example, I took my sourdough and I actually put it in a clear jar and I fed it the normal amount. So this was a tablespoon of starter and 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water for a total of 225 grams. I'll use all of this when I bake because I'm going to use 200 grams in my tartine recipe. But I marked the level it was at 9 a.m. It's now about 6 hours later, and I marked the level so you can see that it's actually doubled in that amount of time. In fact, it's starting to decrease a little bit because it's taken me a little while to get to making this video. But nonetheless, having a starter that at room temperature can double in somewhere between 5 and 8 hours is a really good sign. And this past week, I've actually been doing a few experiments to see how active my starter is and how quickly it will come to room temperature, how quickly it will mature. I'm going to actually show you a photo of one of the things I did earlier this week, which was that I took a starter from 3 different states. So I had a starter that was about a week old and had come straight out of the refrigerator, and I fed it right away, cold. And then I had the same starter, so about a week old, my normal pace, I let it come to room temperature for about 1 hour, and then I fed it. And then I had one that I had fed what I call a double feed, which is I fed it the night before and the morning of. And I'm going to show you the photo. So what you can see is that in the 6 hours that I let the starter mature, the cold starter straight from the fridge actually did not grow very much. Now normally I did let these sit at room temperature, but normally if I was going to go ahead and bake with this, I would let it keep going more than the 6 hours that the other two starters have doubled in before I started to bake. And that's really so that I could make sure that it had gotten to an activity level that was much stronger. Again, I think this just shows that coming straight cold from the fridge, your starter needs to play a little bit of catch up and it needs a little bit more time to hit peak activity. The starter that came to room temperature kept pace mostly with the starter that was double fed, but you can see that the one that I fed the night before and then the morning of really had the most activity. It doubled in the quickest amount of time. And what this says to me is, again, how your starter is cared for can really make a difference in the end result and in your crumb. So I followed through with my experiment and I actually baked 3 loaves of bread with those 3 starters. Again, I baked them with the same level of maturity of starter, about 6 hours. And normally with that cold from the fridge starter, you know, I would either feed it overnight and let it sit for more like 10 to 12 hours, or I would just put it in a warmer place to let it incubate a little bit faster, to let it hit that peak activity. So maybe it was a little unfair to the cold starter to bake it before it was ready. But what I could noticed in the baking process is that the 3 doughs actually developed rather differently. So as I was doing my mixing and then my stretch and folds, I did notice that the cold starter, as it were, was definitely slower to develop and had less visible bubbles. It definitely felt less springy by the time I was done. The starter that I let come to room temperature had a really nice consistency and developed nicely, and the double fed starter really had the most activity, which is absolutely what I would have expected from this experiment. And then you can see in this photo from my 3 baked breads that in fact the starters performed very much as one might predict. The cold from the fridge starter, again, treated the same as the others, had the most tight crumb and the least oven spring. It was visibly smaller than the other 2 loaves of bread. I actually was pleasantly surprised with the starter that I brought to room temperature and then baked and then fed, that it actually had a really nice amount of both bubbles and a lightness to the crumb. It had really good oven spring. I might have baked this one a couple minutes longer so it had more color on the crust. And that was because I forgot to set my timer, but nonetheless, you can see that it turned out to be really quite a nice loaf of bread. And then the double fed, I thought was just an absolutely magnificent loaf of bread. It had the lightest crumb and just had a really wonderful texture. Again, noting that all 3 of these sourdoughs did not have an overpoweringly sour taste. They had a nice tang to them. You could tell that they were sourdoughs, but none of them was like a hit you over the head sourdough. A couple other things I've been observing as I work with my couple of other things as I've been working on improving my baking is, again, in my previous video, I actually gave guidelines for for mixing your dough. So adding your leaven, your mature leaven, your water, and your flour, doing an autolyse of maybe 25 to 30 minutes. I've actually been letting that go a little bit longer to more like 45 minutes to an hour. Some people say that you can autolyse for up to 2 hours, and that it will really benefit your bread. And then you add the salt and the water and additional water. One of the things I've been reading about is that when you add that salt, it really actually tightens the gluten, and it kind of takes the bread dough into a new phase. That phase, of course, we talked about before, is the bulk fermentation. And in my previous video, I mentioned that you can really do that in 2 hours with turns every 30 minutes. And that is true. I have made many a loaf of bread with 2 hours of bulk fermentation, and I've been very happy with them. But I have been working on doing a slightly longer bulk fermentation, and you really do that based on your environmental conditions. So sometimes your house might be more humid or less humid, and that might actually improve the fermentation speed. And then also your room temperature or environmental temperature. So again, those are factors that might impact how quickly or slowly you do your bulk fermentation. But I have been going for 3.5 to 4 hours. And what I notice is that definitely that increases the longer you bulk ferment your dough, the more lactic acid and the more sour you're gonna have of underlying flavor to your bread. But also the texture of the bread is going to be that much more open and light. So just something that you can play around with. There's no set rule for how long you want to bulk ferment. I do notice that it is possible to over bulk ferment your dough as well. And what happens then is that the lactic acid is going to eat up the sugars. So I've also sometimes noticed a problem where I cannot get my crust quite as brown as I'd like. And it turns out if you're having trouble and you're noticing that your crust, no matter how much extra time you bake your bread for, remains kind of a blonde and not a caramelized color, that probably is a sign that you might want to cut back on your bulk fermentation, because actually it's a sign that the sugars have been consumed in your dough and it doesn't really allow for a full caramelization. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up my bread and come back and have some final thoughts for you tomorrow. So let's take a look at the result. These 2 loaves were made from double fed starter. So that's the starter that I fed first 2 nights ago, and then again yesterday morning at about 10 a.m. and I let it sit for 6 hours, and then I mixed my dough together. This dough and this bread I did let do bulk rise for approximately 3 hours. So that's 1 more hour, total of I think 8 turns, including the autolyse, than I did in my original Tartine 101 video. Then I let it ferment overnight in the fridge, and this morning I got up, turned the oven on, and baked them up. A couple things to notice: that the crust is a beautiful caramelization. There's a really good ear. I've actually been reading up. There are a couple other things. You can tell how your bread bake is coming by how much oven spring you have. So here you can see that this whole width is really the bread opening up in the oven. I will say it's not as high a loaf as I've seen in some of my other bakes, but also this was maybe the smaller half. So I would say probably about 800 grams of dough, and I put it in my very large cast oven. And of course the amount of room you have for baking makes a difference too. And then the other thing is that I took the larger half and I baked it into a batard shape. So I can do a video talking about the batard. But I've been playing around with this shape. With a batard, you do your final shaping a little bit differently, so I can do a demo of how to do that. But one of the nice things about a batard is when you slice it, it has a much more rounded slice. It's just a different shape. I think it's a little easier to cut than your boule, which I typically cut in half and then slice crosswise. But let's take a look at both of these and see how the crumb came out from that double fed starter. So one of the things I've learned in doing these videos, if you cut right at the end, sometimes you're not going to get the fullness of the view of the crumb. So I'm going to cut in a little bit. And this is perfect because it's about lunchtime, and I think we're going to want to have a little bread with food. So here you can see, and the other thing I noticed with the batard, so this is a very even crumb. I would say it's a springy crumb. It doesn't have the huge holes, but it's got a lot of really nicely distributed bubbles, and I'm very happy with it. It doesn't have a tightness that you would have in another loaf. And then the other one I'm going to open up as well, just because this is the fun. Even after baking for all these years, I feel like there's still just a little surprise. How did each loaf turn out? What happened? You know, what's the end result going to be? So let's take a look at this one. And just getting that last crumb. Again, you can see that has a really nice, evenly open, springy crumb. It doesn't have those huge bubbles that form from gaps. And I think that that also has to do with how you do your bulk rise. But I will say that this is a really nice result, and I'm looking forward to digging in. So I hope this video was helpful to give you some ideas. I would encourage everyone to spend a week feeding your starter and seeing what happens, or even a day. Put it in a glass mason jar or a glass container and mark off with tape where it starts, at what time, and see how long it takes to fully double. And if you want to be scientific or semi-scientific, you can feed multiple starters in different conditions. You can do one at room temperature and one proofed in your oven. Or you can do one where you double feed like I did and one where you single feed. Let me know how it goes, and share your results in the comments. Thanks for watching.